Looks like we got everything set to go, and wow, do we have a lot to talk about today. We've got a ton to talk about tonight. So much happened in Utah politics today. Up on the Hill with this special session. Most of it is about redistricting, and we're going to talk about the maps. I'm going to show you some of the maps. I've already done some quick analysis about that. There's so much to discuss. Welcome into the show. My name is Brian Schott. I am the publisher and managing editor of UtahPoliticalWatch.news. I'm an independent journalist. I've been covering Utah politics for more than 25 years, and I love doing these live streams to help you understand not only what is happening in Utah politics, but why and where we may go from here. Let's talk about these new maps. As I had been reporting all week, last week into this week, the legislature picked Map C. Map Option C, that was the one that they voted to send to the judge today. Today was the deadline for the legislature to pick a brand new map or to pick a new map proposal that they would submit to Judge Diana Gibson, 3rd District Judge here in Utah. But that was not the only map she got today, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the legislature, as expected, passed Map C. Map C just so happened to be the map that gives the Republicans the largest partisan advantage of the 5 map proposals they put forward 10 days ago or last month, a couple of weeks ago, when they decided to release their map proposals for legislative redistricting. As Eris Patty says on TikTok, as a shock to no one. Exactly, as a shock to no one. If you paid attention to what happened at the legislature, not only today, but over the past couple of weeks as they were considering these maps, as they were drawing these maps, lawmakers spent a good portion of time talking about the fact that they were not allowed to use partisan data. And they stayed away from partisan data. And they spent a lot of time wagging their fingers at anybody who even suggested that they used or considered partisan data when they were considering these maps. At the same time, we were supposed to be completely unaware of the fact that the Republican Party in Utah, along with several county Republican parties, along with several Utah organizations that are aligned with the Republican Party, like the Utah Eagle Forum, were rallying the troops behind Map Option C, the map that gave the Republicans the largest partisan advantage of all the map proposals. They were rallying the troops behind that, and guess which one Republicans picked? Oh, just the one that happened to give them the largest partisan advantage. But there was absolutely no partisan political data used in picking those maps. It was just happenstance. Let me bring up those maps. Put these in Dave's redistricting. Now, this is not the only map that we're going to deal with and the only map that we're going to see. So, I entered this into Dave's redistricting, and this is Option C. This is the congressional map that the legislature voted to submit to the judge today. The red district would be the 1st district. That covers the counties of Rich, Cache, Weber, Davis, and Box Elder. The purple one would be, I believe, District 2, and that is the western half of Salt Lake County and Tooele County. The light green, that I think is District 3. That's the remainder of Salt Lake County, part of Utah County, Wasatch, Summit, Daggett, Duchesne, Uinta, Carbon, Emery, Grand, and San Juan. And then District 4 is the remainder of the state, Utah County, all the way down to Washington and Kane County. So this is the map that the legislature put forward to the judge. This was their submission. And as I have reported in the past, and if you look at the partisan breakdown, I'm going to bring this up in front of me here. According to the partisan breakdown, all 4 districts, if you put the previous election results on top of them, input in those into the districts, you will see that all 4 of the districts would have gone to Donald Trump in 2024 and 2020. But District 2 and District 3, which on your screen are the purple and green districts, those would have been a little bit closer. District 2 would have gone for Donald Trump in 2024 by about 6 points and by about 4 points in there in 2020. District 3 would be even closer. That one would have gone for Donald Trump in 2024 by about 2.5 points, and in 2020 by 0.5 point. So these are very, very close districts. But all 4 of the districts would be favoring a Republican. But it wasn't just the legislature who submitted maps to the judge today. The plaintiffs in the case, the people who sued because the legislature repealed Prop 4, they also got to submit maps, and they submitted 2 of them today around the same time. And both of them are kind of interesting. This is the second map. This is map 2. And if you look at it, it looks a hell of a lot like map C. It just makes one little change, and I'm going to zoom in on it right here. If you look at the way Salt Lake is divided, and this is plaintiff map 2. If you look at the way Salt Lake is divided, under the legislature's map, which is right here, under the legislature's map, Salt Lake City is sliced off into the green district. Most everything is the same on the 2 maps, but the biggest change is that Salt Lake City is sliced off into the green district under the legislature's map. But under the plaintiff's map, they keep Salt Lake City together with Tooele County. They don't break up the Salt Lake urban core. They keep it with South Salt Lake and West Valley City. Under the legislature's map, South Salt Lake and West Valley City are sliced off from Salt Lake City. That makes a massive difference when you look at the partisan leanings of these maps. It makes a huge difference. But under map C from the legislature, District 2, which is the purple district on your map, under map C, District 2 in 2024 would have gone for Donald Trump by about 6.5 points. If you flip that around and put Salt Lake City into that district, put Salt Lake City into District 2 like we're looking at here, the map on your screen in the purple part, that takes that district from Trump plus 6.5 in 2024 to Harris plus 13. That's how big of a difference Salt Lake City makes. And now you look at those 2 maps and you can understand exactly why the legislature, why they decided to slice off Salt Lake City and put it into another district. Because the rest of this massive district here, let me zoom out, the rest of this massive green district, this is the plaintiff's map, and it's essentially the same as the legislature's map, but the rest of this massive green district has enough Republican vote to counteract the massive Democratic vote in Salt Lake City. You cannot look at this information and think any other way. But remember, the legislature was not allowed to consider any partisan data when drawing these maps. It just so happens that when you slice Salt Lake City proper off of South Salt Lake and West Valley City and put it into another district, you have enough Republican vote in the other district to counterbalance the Democratic vote in Salt Lake City. But again, they didn't consider any partisan data. No, not at all. In fact, they wagged their fingers at all of us. But I look at these numbers, and it's pretty darn clear that's the effect of these 2 maps. Now, by the rules, you can't consider partisan data, but the effect of the 2 maps. And the biggest change between Plaintiff Map 2 and Option C is that Salt Lake City is divided away from the rest of the Salt Lake urban core in South Salt Lake and West Valley City. You slice that off, and there's enough of the Republican vote along the eastern side of the state to counteract that, to mute that. It takes this purple district, the purple district that we're looking at right now, this is the legislature's district. In 2024, that would have been Trump plus 6.4%. You look at this purple district, which is what the plaintiffs put in, and it takes a Trump plus 6 district to Harris plus 13. That's almost a 20-point swing right there. Just something to consider. Stuart on YouTube says they didn't look at the data, they just had Sean Trended do a test that precluded any other outcome. Ding, 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 ding. Yep, exactly. Stuart, 100% on tap. Stuart is a subscriber to Utah Political Watch, and he's a very authoritative voice about redistricting, especially on our Discord. I appreciate you, Stuart. Thank you. There was one other district that the plaintiffs submitted today. This one's a little bit different because it creates a single district, this red district here, which is centered around most of Salt Lake County. As we've talked about before, Salt Lake County has to be split because there's just too much population to make a single congressional district. They tried to keep Salt Lake County together as much as possible. So this red district, which is right in the middle of three pretty massive districts, would be one district and the rest of them would be around that. It does split Utah County in half, though. So it splits Salt Lake County and cleaves off the southwestern portion of Salt Lake County, which Riverton, that area of Salt Lake County. But it also splits Utah County in half between these two districts. What does that seat do electorally? Oh, I'm glad you asked. If you look at the previous election results from 2024, the Salt Lake City district would have been Harris plus approximately 24. So a pretty strong Democratic district, surrounded by three very strong Republican districts. District 2, the northern one, the blue on your map, would have gone for Trump by about 30 points, 29, 30 points. District 3, which is the green district, that's Trump plus 40 in 2024. And the last district, the blue district on your map, the light blue, that one would have been Trump by about 31. So you get three extremely strong Republican districts and one really strong Democratic district. Now, and this map, they said was drawn using the rules in the piece of legislation that we've talked about before, passed by Brady Brammer, or sponsored by Brady Brammer, that lawmakers slammed through during the special session today. We'll come back to all that in a minute. Let me see if I can get to some of your questions. Sorry if you've said this, but is the vote over yet? Yes, up on Capitol Hill, the legislature has approved Map C. Looking over now on Instagram, Palmerdale777 says, my representative told me that their only obligation was to divine partisan symmetry and therefore supported the Brammer bill. I took him to task on that. We have to talk about the process that they used for this bill from Senator Brady Brammer. As we've talked about before, there is no defined test in Prop 4 to measure how fair a map is. It only uses a term called partisan symmetry. And lawmakers seized on that, and they rammed a bill through the legislature today in a special session that creates some really complicated mathematical formulas so that they can define partisan symmetry. But what they actually do is they set it up so that you will never be able to draw a district that favors a Democrat, because they want it to look like it. They want these districts to mirror the electoral performance of the state as a whole. And Utah's a Republican state, so you're going to get 4 Republicans in 4 congressional districts. And they have set these tests up, and they're incredibly complicated. But the end result is that you're going to get what happens with the Utah vote statewide on a district-by-district basis. And let's talk a little bit about the process, because you need to understand what lawmakers did in order to get this done. So, when the Legislative Redistricting Committee met for the first time last month, this proposal from Senator Brammer was on the agenda. And they had a debate about it, and they talked about it. But in that proposal, they only had one test, one definition for defining what is fair, and that's partisan symmetry. And they got some blowback. There was a lot of blowback about that. On Friday, after Governor Cox called the legislature into special session, Senator Brammer introduced a new version of his bill that had 2 new tests in it. And you can find it on the legislature's website. It's SB 1011. As it was introduced, it had not just one test, it had 3 tests. It had a test called ensemble analysis, and that says you just use a computer and you draw at least 4,000 maps following these rules, and anything that's on the edges, any map that's outside of this predetermined window, 2.5% in either direction, those are gerrymandered and they are immediately culled. You can't use those maps. The second test that he added into this bill that we only saw for the first time on Friday evening was called the mean median test. It measures how far a party's district level performance strays from the statewide average. Maps showing more than a 2% deviation from that statewide average get axed. That mandates that these districts would mirror Utah's Republican-dominated statewide results. And then it also had what we talked about before, which was the partisan symmetry. But at the heart of all of these tests is a calculation that Brammer introduced called the partisan index. And what you do is you take the results of the last 3 statewide elections for U.S. President, Governor, Attorney General, State Treasurer, State Auditor. You average 3 of those, the 3 most recent. So for this test, it would be U.S. President, Governor, and Attorney General. And then you look at what each party gets as an average. And I think for Republicans, it was around 57, 58%. And for Democrats, it was about 33%. And that window right there, that gap right there is the partisan index. And that's what all these calculations are based off of. So if you fit in that window, it would be a fair map. Oh, and by the way, if you remember in 2024, in the governor's race, Phil Lyman ran as a write-in candidate. Well, Brammer's bill accounts for that, and the 13.5% of the vote that Phil Lyman got in 2024, those are just counted as Republican votes for purpose of calculating this average, which raises the Republican average by about 4.5%. So all of that was in the bill that we saw for the very first time on Friday evening. No public debate, no hearing, coming in cold. Then, today, when the bill was introduced on the Senate floor, Brammer had a substitute. And the substitute was even more complicated. It added something called a sequential Monte Carlo simulation, which is part of that ensemble thing. It's a Monte Carlo simulation to generate an ensemble of at least 4,000 redistricting plans. It was much more complicated. At least we had 3 days lead time for the last version, but this new version, Brammer introduced it on the Senate floor. Nobody had any chance to digest it. Most people were seeing it for the first time when he introduced this on the Senate floor, and the Senate passed it. Minimal debate, passed. Over to the House, minimal debate, passed. But there was a reason why they did it quickly. They rammed this bill through the House and the Senate today before lunch. They had it passed before lunch. And Governor Cox signed it at about 1:17 p.m. today. And this is why. Because the bill, essentially, these tests will tie the judge's hands. The judge will have to use these tests in determining whether or not a map meets Prop 4. They added the new parameters for Prop 4 and then said these are the ones that you must use, Judge. And they had a provision in the bill that said if it passed by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, it becomes law the moment the governor signs it. They rushed this thing through in the morning part of the legislative session. The governor signs it, and then they pass the maps. Because then the map proposal they send to the court was under this new law because the law went into effect immediately. So you have this incredibly complicated system, this incredibly complicated bill that we only saw the first version of on Friday, and then they introduce a more complicated version on the Senate floor, and there you go. Rammed it through, passed it, it's the law. Now, the plaintiffs filed a brief attacking this, and I'm going to get to that in a second because it's pretty well crafted, and it comes in hot. On YouTube, Katie Adams Anderton says, how did they count McMullen? They don't. They don't, because U.S. Senate is conveniently excluded from this calculation. U.S. President is fined, Governor fined, Attorney General fined, U.S. Senate no. Also, they wrote it in such a way that McMullen running for Senate against Mike Lee would have been excluded anyway. Phil Lyman ran for governor as a Republican in the primary. He sought the Republican nomination, and that's why they're thinking his votes would just be Republican votes. I told you before, they did this earlier this year at the Republican State Convention. They have a formula they use inside the party to allocate delegates. Counties get certain amount of delegates based on the election results. It's like a power index. And Lyman running as a write-in screwed that up. So they just used an internal party rule to count those Lyman votes as Republican votes so that they could get the right distribution of delegates. Salt Lake County, I think, would have lost a bunch of delegates had they not done this. So if it's good enough as an internal party rule for the Republicans, then it's, 100% good enough to put into state law when determining gerrymandering standards. Palmerdale says, do you know how Representative Steve Ellison voted on the Brammer bill? Well, let me look at that for you. Ellison was a no. It passed the House with 55 yes and 18 no and 2 not voting. What are the next steps? New lawsuit? I'm going to get to the filing from the plaintiffs in a second about this. LV Spira says, seems like Prop 4 should be interpreted by the laws that existed when Prop 4 was passed. Well, the problem is Prop 4 was very vague when it was passed. Intentionally, because as you'll see in this filing, they said that it was written that way so that they could account for new information, new ways of assessing maps. But the legislature went the other way. And also, these really, really complex calculations to determine whether a map is fair or not, they only apply to congressional maps. They do not apply to state house. They do not apply to state senate. They do not apply to the state school board. Can't use them. But you have to use them on the congressional maps. Aris Batty says, we're going to make a map based on the unfair maps we already had. That's the thing. Under this calculation in Brammer's bill, the old maps, the maps from 2021, would have probably passed. They would have been considered completely fair. So tonight, the plaintiffs in the lawsuit had a supplemental filing attacking this new bill from Brammer. And it's pretty well written. Now remember, it's SB 1011, so I'm going to read from this, and I will try to read as slowly as possible so everyone can understand. So I'm going to read from their filing with the court attacking this bill that was this new law, because it's a new law as of 1:17 p.m. today, Mountain Standard Time. They write in their suit, SB 1011 profoundly impairs Proposition 4's prohibition on partisan gerrymandering in several ways. Its primary feature is to infect the law with a cherry-picked test, the partisan bias test, that is universally known to be inappropriate for use in states like Utah that were not politically competitive in statewide elections. That's important. That is an important thing because, as we've talked about before, the partisan bias test imagines a tied election. and say that one party gets 55% of the vote and then they win 55% of the seats up for election. Then under fair maps, then if the other party somehow got 55% of the vote, you would also expect them to get 55% of the seats. It doesn't work in states like Utah. The people who came up with this calculation say you cannot use it in states like Utah simply because Utah is so profoundly tilted towards the GOP, it won't give you the right results, okay? But that's the test they're using here. Continuing on with the complaint from the plaintiffs. This is because applying the test in states like Utah causes false and irrational results. It labels maps that provide the minority party, Democrats, with a single district biased against Democrats because they would not win a second district in the imaginary world in which elections suddenly become tied statewide. The test prioritizes focusing on the imaginary world of tied elections over the actual world of lopsided state elections. Thus, it labels maps and provides Democrats 0 districts unbiased against them, and maps that provide Democrats 1 district biased against them. This makes no sense in the real world of Utah elections, and this is why the political scientists who developed the test have repeatedly warned it should not be applied to non-competitive states like Utah. For similar reasons, political scientists agree that the second test adopted by the legislature in SB 1011, the mean median difference test, should not be used to assess partisan gerrymandering in non-competitive states. And the third assessment, an ensemble analysis, has serious design flaws that impair Proposition 4's reforms. Inexplicably, SB 1011 untethers the set of ensemble maps from Proposition 4's neutral redistricting criteria and infects it by culling maps that do not pass this flawed partisan bias test. And here we're getting to the point. Together, these changes to Proposition 4 systematically neuter its prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. In fact, they operate to require partisan gerrymandering. They do so by systematically disqualifying the vast majority of maps compliant with Proposition 4's neutral redistricting criteria, any maps that create district favoring Democrats in Salt Lake County, because they do not create a second Democratic district in an imaginary tied election scenario that have not and do not actually occur in Utah. So basically what they're arguing is these tests that the legislature proposed that are now law in Utah, they actually require partisan gerrymandering. Instead of getting rid of partisan gerrymandering, instead of creating a system that is more fair, it actually requires partisan gerrymandering. They said SB 1011 makes this new framework a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's applicable only to assessing congressional maps. And here's why. The partisan bias test operates irrationally in Utah. It labels congressional maps, which just have 4 districts that are obviously extreme gerrymanders, as unbiased, and maps that are partisan neutral biased. For congressional maps, this irrational feature of the test benefits Republicans. But the partisan bias test would label Utah state legislative maps as extremely biased, while other more appropriate tests like the efficiency gap do not. If SB 1011 were to apply its test to all maps, Republicans would suffer the effect of its irrationality for the state legislative maps. The fact that the SB 1011 seizes upon the partisan bias test irrationality only when it benefits the majority party and not when it harms the majority party is a perfect illustration of how the new law requires rather than prohibits party favoritism in redistricting. It's hard to argue against that. I can't wait to see how the legislature responds. The fact that they cherry-picked this test, that the people came up with it said you should not use it in Utah, and they're like, we're absolutely going to use it in Utah, but only on the congressional maps because that gives us the outcome that we want. Representative Candace Perucci, the co-chair of the legislature's redistricting committee, has joined the live on Instagram. Evening, Representative. Glad to have you on board. Talking about what happened today up on the Hill. So that's the filing from the plaintiffs in this case. That's what they said in their court filing attacking SB 1011. Stewart on YouTube says the legislature's argument is just going to be that the poor design of Prop 4 requires that test. Probably. And I will admit that they do have a point. I mean, you can argue that Prop 4 was written vaguely and the judge leaves it up to the legislature to come up with the standards, right? But it is curious that this test only applies to the congressional maps and not the legislative maps, because if you use these tests on the legislative maps, you would see that they were gerrymandered. It'll be interesting to see how the judge parses that. We'll be seeing them make all their filings about this over the next few weeks. I believe they have a hearing, or the deadline for filing. Both sides have until October 17th to file their briefs in the case and materials in support of the maps or opposition to the maps. And then we may have a court hearing somewhere around October. They're scheduled for October 23rd and 24th. Going through some of the other comments. When they send an email, say to comment on the map they favor. It says, so the new map wasn't supposed to use political opinions. How's the GOP going to get away with that when they send out an email saying to comment on the map they favor? That, I mean, it... And I know that Representative Prucci is going to get really mad, and I know she's watching. She's going to get upset about this. But they spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks wagging their finger at anybody who dared to suggest that partisan data was used. And maybe they didn't consult partisan data. Maybe they said, as Stewart said in the chat, that they just had a preferred outcome and then had their expert draw a map that did that. Who knows? We will never know. But it's really hard to accept that finger wagging, that shaming about no partisan data, when their own party is launching a massive campaign to get people to support the map that gives them the largest partisan advantage. Those two things seem at odds. It strains credulity. C. Trevor Nelson says, it's clearly impossible to ignore partisan bias. That's how bias works. I am not a redistricting expert, and it's hard. I've sat down and tried to draw maps, and it is frustrating. It really is. But if you look at the maps that were submitted, let's start with option C. This is the map that was passed by the legislature earlier today. This is their proposal. And as you can see, Salt Lake County is divided in two. And that big flat line right above the word Salt Lake, that big flat line right there, if you can see that, above that line is Salt Lake City proper. And Salt Lake City was intentionally cut out of the purple district that is the west side of Salt Lake County. Below that flat line on the map is South Salt Lake and West Valley City. Pretty big population areas. You add Salt Lake City in that's the urban core. Now, this is the plaintiff's map. And if you'll notice, the purple, where the word Salt Lake are cut in half. What that does is it keeps the urban core of Salt Lake County together. And that changes how that map would operate. It 100% changes how that map would operate in an election. I told you about that earlier, but as I looked at it, under the legislature's map, which cuts Salt Lake City off from the urban core, you get a district, the purple district, would have gone for Donald Trump by 6.4 points. You add Salt Lake City back into that, and then you get a district that would have gone for Kamala Harris by about 13 points in 2024. Just something to think about there. Ryan says, nice Dead Kennedys t-shirt. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm trying to go back through some of these other comments on TikTok. Lady of the Great Salt Lake says, these people have been running campaigns before, they know where their voters lie. Well, you would think. But again, if you take them at their word, they didn't use any partisan data. Just so happens that cutting Salt Lake City out of the urban core dramatically changes how those districts would work. Palmerdale, the test also disregards factors like the importance of voting districts to become packed when necessary, such as the Salt Lake County area. I think what he's referencing there is there are two concepts in gerrymandering. There's packing and there's cracking. And you either pack all of the voters from one party into as small of areas possible, so you make these districts that are really heavily towards one party or the other, and then the rest of the districts go for the other party. And cracking is when you take these large areas of voters for one party or the other and you crack them up. That's what they did under the map in 2021. That's why Salt Lake County is divided into 4 pieces. They cracked it. Salt Lake County was cracked for a particular reason. What was that reason? To make sure that we had 4 districts that would be Republican plus 15 or so. Trevor Nelson says, attaching Provo and St. George is totally gerrymandering. The problem is you're going to get that in a state like Utah because we only have 4 congressional districts. And we've got a massive state. And so you're going to get these huge districts. It does make me uncomfortable when I look at a district, when I look at a map like what the plaintiffs did with one of their map proposals. This map proposal right here, this is the plaintiff's other map proposal. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable because if you look at the size of that green district, that is a massive district. And it's hard to consider that a fair district. But it is because it has equal population to the other 3 districts. That little red spot in the middle has the same population as the other 3 districts. And that's because the cities are where the people are. Stewart says it's why I recommend anyone interested in this process to try drawing maps themselves. Exactly. Stewart is a map drawing fiend. He draws them all the time. I saw so many of his maps on the legislative website, and they made me laugh because he would label them things like deliberate gerrymander. Let's see. Oh, former Representative Rosemary Lesser is on the stream tonight. Nice to have you on board. Justin Snar says, I thought a nonpartisan group was supposed to make the maps with the new laws. That's what this lawsuit's about. In 2018, there was a ballot initiative called Proposition 4. And Proposition 4 created an independent redistricting commission. It took redistricting duties away from the legislature, created a 7-person commission who would draw the maps based on a certain set of rules. And it also banned partisan gerrymandering. In 2020, the legislature repealed that law with SB 200. They kept the independent commission, but they were not given the final decision on drawing these maps. Instead, they were an advisory role. They did come up with 3 maps, but the legislature was not required to consider them at all. And this lawsuit said that the legislature illegally or unconstitutionally overrode the will of the people by repealing Prop 4, and the judges agreed with that. So that's where that came from. Oh, and there's Senator Todd Weiler. Evening, Senator Weiler. We are getting so many members of the legislature to tune into the live stream. This is awesome. We had House Speaker Mike Schultz a couple of weeks ago. Tonight we've had Representative Candace Perucci, Senator Todd Weiler. I'm sure there's a few others. I knew I was popular up there. Just didn't know it was this popular. So now I'm going to say something that I think, I'm going to say something on the side of lawmakers. And I think they may have a point here. Prop 4 gave redistricting duties to an independent commission. And the people have the right to try to reform their government through a ballot initiative. But the Utah Constitution specifically says that the legislature is in charge of redistricting. It says that that's their job. Like, it specifically mentions them. And I think that there's a constitutional conflict there. I know the legislature is going to be making this argument. I know they have somewhat in the past, but I think they're going to make this argument more strongly in the coming days. There is a conflict there, and I think it's a pretty significant conflict, because the Constitution of the state says this is the job of the legislature, and you cannot have a law or a ballot initiative, which is what it is, override the Constitution. I think there is a very strong argument to be made there. That has not been fully litigated. I think the legislature has a hell of a point to make. I think it's much stronger than this rushed SB 1011 that they rammed through to try and game the system on the congressional maps to get a short-term advantage. It's the same thing they did with Amendment D last year when the Utah Supreme Court said they unconstitutionally repealed Prop 4, so they ran into special session to try to put an amendment on, a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would have given them unfettered power to do what they did. It's that really short-term thinking. They didn't have a strong argument then. I think they have a very strong argument by saying that the Constitution already says that we are the ones who do the redistricting. It has not been fully litigated, and I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion as we move along in this process, because, as I said, it is a very, very strong argument. Let's look at some of the comments. Ryan Hi-Fi says, so we need to push for a constitutional amendment then. You can't. You can't, because in Utah, the only people who can propose a constitutional amendment is the Utah legislature. The people can't do that. You cannot petition for a constitutional amendment in Utah. That's the way it's set up. Only the legislature can propose a constitutional amendment. Good idea, won't work. I understand your sentiment, but there's no mechanism at all for the people to do something about a constitutional amendment or lack of constitutional amendment. That's the way the system is set up. The legislature is notorious for ignoring votes and doing what they want instead of what the people want. We passed Prop 4 for a reason. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been covering politics for a long time. This is literally, I think, my fourth redistricting cycle. I was here in 2001. I was here in 2011, 2021, and I'm here now. This is my fourth cycle. When Prop 4 passed, and then the legislature decided to repeal it with SB 200, the argument they made was that it barely passed in the state. It only passed in 4 counties. I can't remember the number of Senate districts it passed in. If Senator Weiler has that number, and I know you have that number because I remember you making that argument on the floor, how many Senate districts it actually passed in, I can look that up. But that was the argument they made. They said it passed with like 50, just over 50% of the vote. And it only passed in 4 counties. And so that's why they were justified in overriding it. And they made a deal with, you hear them talk about how they made a deal with the Better Boundaries people. It was kind of a deal that they really had no choice on that deal. It was going to happen anyway. So they had to try to negotiate to get anything in that. But the argument they used at the time was that it only passed in 4 counties, passed with just over 50% of the vote. I don't think it even got to 50.5. But that's how elections work. I mean, that's the game. It has to pass. You get 50 plus 1 and you win. Crenad on Instagram says, we need to push to vote them out. That is the only recourse. They largely don't listen to their constituents, so they need to be fired. We need good opposition candidates. Stuart says that Prop 4 passed by 0.6%. Okay. Thank you, Stuart. I agree with that, but it's for selfish reasons as a journalist. And the selfish reason is, if we had more competitive elections, it would be much more interesting for me. It would make my job so much more interesting. Because you have competitive elections, right? I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm accused of being an activist. I'm accused of being on one side or the other. I really don't have a dog in this fight. I root for I root for chaos. I root for things that are interesting, that make my job interesting. And competitive elections would make my job much more interesting. It's boring when you know who's going to win. I am interested in what's going to happen with map C. Because if this is the map that the judge ends up picking, these two districts, the purple district and the green district, yeah, they went for Donald Trump in 2024 and 2020, but by 6.4% or less. That is interesting to me because those districts, if you get a wave election, they suddenly can become competitive. That's how Ben McAdams got elected in the first place. Ben McAdams, when he first ran in 2018, he was in a Republican plus 10 or plus 11 district, a pretty safe Republican district. What happened was you got a wave election for Democrats that year, and suddenly what looked like a safe Republican plus 10 seat all of a sudden got caught up in the wave. And McAdams won by a couple hundred votes over Republican Mia Love because of a wave election. And that was Republican plus 10 or 11. These two seats here, the purple and the green on the map, those are Republican like 6.5% at the most. You get a wave election, and suddenly things get really interesting. Eris Patty says, hey, let's apply that to all the votes. Sorry, you didn't actually win. It was only by 0.6%. Stuart on TikTok. Most of these legislators live in safe districts, and even if we had fair legislative maps, most of them still would live in safe districts. True. It's the fatal flaw in our electoral system. If you're a 40% minority in a district, not only are legislators not incentivized to listen to you, their own party will actively punish them if they do. The only real system is to replace the electoral system. Unfortunately, this is the system that we got. When people talk about a third party, I'll believe it when I see it. The biggest thing that's driving American politics today is a concept called negative partisanship. People don't vote for things, they vote against things. My favorite book is Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail by Hunter S. Thompson. And in that book, he has a passage that has stuck with me for years. And he talks about, even back then, 1972, people were not voting for things, they were voting against things. And he longed for the day of people voting for things. And we just don't vote for things anymore. We vote against stuff. Negative partisanship is a very, very powerful incentive. Adventures of Elkman says, how about ranked choice voting for Congress? Good luck. Good luck getting that passed here in Utah. We had a ranked choice voting pilot program for some municipal elections, and it was working. Cities could decide whether they wanted in or not. And I think in 2021, we had a lot of cities involved in it. And then everybody turned against it. And it was, in 2021, I think were the most cities and municipalities using ranked choice voting. And then the election integrity crowd and the election denialism people, they all got involved and pushed back against it. And now once that pilot program ends, I think this is the final year of the pilot program. Once that ends, it's not going to be renewed, and then we're not going to use ranked choice voting. All right, we're going to wrap it up. We'll probably do another one sometime this week as we learn more about the redistricting and how everything is playing out. But I want to thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate you. I think we're building a little bit of a community here, which is my goal. I want to create a place where we can talk about politics, where I can help explain what the heck is happening in Utah politics. That's why I called the show that, because I've been doing this for a long time. I know where the bodies are buried. I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends. And I understand what they're trying to do. And people have questions. People want to understand. And people disconnect from politics because they don't understand what is going on. And like the saying says, I mean, if you don't take an interest in politics, it's still going to take an interest in you. And that's why it's important to understand, because then you can become an engaged member of our society. And it's been severely lacking. I was a civics dork in high school. I love this stuff. I know you may not love this stuff, but I'm going to try to help you understand it. So thank you again for joining. Thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your evening tonight. Thank you, Representative Perucci and Senator Weiler, for joining the live stream. Really appreciate having you on board. And now a plug for my other products. I am an independent journalist here in Utah. I run a website called utahpoliticalwatch.news. If you haven't yet, please sign up for my newsletter. It's absolutely free. It helps me build this endeavor that I'm trying to create. As an independent journalist, I don't have a billionaire who owns my website. I don't have a billionaire sugar daddy who keeps everything afloat. It's my readers. It's my viewers. It's my subscribers. People who pay for a paid subscription or make one-time donation. They're the ones who fund this. They make what I do possible. So if you haven't yet, go to my website, utahpoliticalwatch.news, sign up for my newsletter. If you can, and I know things are tough right now, and I get it. If you can become a paid subscriber, if you can make a one-time donation, if you can become a paid subscriber, you'll get some extra stuff. You'll get access to our Discord where you'll get to talk with Stuart, who's great. Stuart knows so much about redistricting. He's fantastic. He's in the Discord. Other people are as well. You'll get access to that. You'll get some subscriber-only newsletters. I do one every single morning called The Morning Memo. It's got some exclusive reporting, some insights, some of my thoughts on that. That's for subscribers only. It's $5 a month, $55 a year, and you get some extra stuff. Or you can make a one-time donation. Thank you, everybody, for watching tonight. I really appreciate you. I'll send out an email blast, put it on my socials when we're going to do this again. I promise we are going to do this again later this week. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy this. I really appreciate you. Take the time to become an engaged member of society. That's the only way that we're going to get through this thing. Again, thank you for joining and love you all.